Freshly unpacked boxes lined the small living room, giving it the look of a makeshift storage unit rather than a welcoming home. Yet, I felt an uncharacteristic buoyancy as I stared at my modest new abode in Willow Creek, a charming, tree-lined subdivision about 30 minutes outside the city. The houses here came with neatly trimmed lawns, cozy porches, and the friendly vibe of a place where kids still rode bikes along the sidewalk. I was determined to build a life that was calmer than the years I'd spent in cramped apartments and city streets. My health demanded it. After multiple hospital stays and the eventual discovery of a chronic respiratory condition, I'd realized I could no longer chase deadlines in the city's smog and noise. My doctors recommended a quieter environment with cleaner air, and so I used my modest savings to buy this place. The price was decent, the area calm, just what I needed. Within my new little cul-de-sac, the houses all looked like siblings: pastel exteriors, symmetrical flower beds, and standardized mailboxes. The uniform charm was no accident. Willow Creek was governed by a powerful homeowners association, HOA, which set strict guidelines about everything from fence heights to the permissible shades of exterior paint. Coming from a big city, I wasn't used to such rules. But I shrugged it off at first. If conformity was the price of a quiet home with fresh air and a yard where I could eventually plant an herb garden, so be it. The neighbor to my left was an elderly widow named Frances. She greeted me the day I moved in, offering a plate of homemade fudge brownies. "Welcome," she said, eyes crinkling warmly. "Don't let the HOA stuff scare you. They can be strict, but if you follow the rules, you'll be just fine." Her reassurance eased my initial trepidation. Still, I noticed her lower her voice when she mentioned the HOA, as if worried someone might overhear. She concluded by hinting I'd soon meet Karen, the board's most outspoken member. Karen's involved in everything. Nothing goes unnoticed by her. Don't be alarmed if she invites herself onto your property to check your grass or something, Frances joked, though there was an uneasy edge to her smile. Over the next few days, I settled in. My oxygen concentrator machine, vital to my daily comfort, was installed indoors. But because Willow Creek had older home layouts, the technicians recommended placing part of the system outside in a small, ventilated enclosure near the rear of the house, ensuring the warm exhaust air wouldn't build up indoors. It would produce a quiet hum, they said, barely noticeable in normal circumstances. In those first days, life felt refreshingly peaceful. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves on the trimmed maple trees, and the air smelled faintly of flowers from the community's well-tended gardens. I spent time organizing my books, setting up my bedroom, and occasionally stepping out onto my back porch with a cup of herbal tea to enjoy the suburban silence. Little did I know this calm would soon be disrupted by someone who saw even the soft hum of a medical device as a breach of her perceived authority. HOA Karen, as some folks half-jokingly called her, was about to make my life far more complicated than I'd ever imagined. On my fourth morning in Willow Creek, I opened my front door to find a sky-blue envelope pinned under a decorative stone. The letterhead read, Willow Creek Homeowners Association, in an ornate script. A typed note inside welcomed me, congratulated me on my new home, then listed a few helpful reminders. At first, it felt like a standard set of guidelines, stuff about landscaping schedules, garbage collection times, and details about the community pool hours. But near the bottom, in bold, was a statement about noise ordinances and how the HOA maintained a strict limit on mechanical sounds that could disturb neighbors' tranquility. The language was vaguely threatening. Residents are requested to ensure any devices that create persistent noise adhere to the standards found in Section 5.2b. Failure to comply may result in fines and corrective measures. Confused, I wondered if they were referencing my oxygen concentrator. The hum was extremely soft. Even standing by the unit, you'd have to pay close attention to hear it. Could that be considered a persistent noise? I shrugged it off as an overreach. Perhaps the note was a generic form letter, but something about it felt oddly specific. Later that day, as I was watering the small patch of lawn out front, a slim, middle-aged woman strode up the sidewalk with the purposeful gait of someone who had urgent business. Her hair was in a neat bob, blonde streaks meticulously highlighted. She wore a crisp button-up blouse and clutched a clipboard that looked well-traveled. "Hello," she called brightly, though her tone was more supervisory than friendly. "You must be our new neighbor. I'm Karen Miller on the HOA board." Her eyes flicked over me, then my yard, then me again, as though mentally checking items off a list. "I trust you received our welcome letter," she asked. "Yes," I replied, trying to appear cordial. "Thank you. The guidelines are thorough." Karen offered a tight smile. "We pride ourselves on thoroughness. Willow Creek is a gem among communities because we maintain high standards. We noticed you have a device running outside, some kind of compressor." I swallowed. "So it was about the oxygen." "Right," I said, forcing a smile. "It's part of my medical oxygen concentrator system. My respiratory specialist recommended an external setup. It's quieter that way, less heat indoors. Really, it's not loud at all." Karen's eyebrows arched slightly. "Oh, I see. Medical?" "Yes," I continued. "I have a chronic lung condition. The device helps me breathe more easily, especially at night. Without it, I'd need repeated hospital visits." She paused for a moment, as if calculating her next statement. "I see," she repeated. Well, of course, the HOA wouldn't want to cause any hardship to a homeowner with legitimate medical needs. However, her voice softened but retained a certain edge. "Some neighbors have expressed concerns about the noise. Perhaps you could look into moving it or adding extra soundproofing. Our community has a decibel limit for mechanical equipment, as spelled out in the bylaws." I felt a pang of anxiety. "I'll do my best to keep it discreet. But I can't turn it off or bury it. It's essential for my health." Karen nodded sympathetically, though her eyes glinted with impatience. "I understand. Let's just be mindful of the community's serenity. We don't want anything to disturb the environment we've worked so hard to cultivate." And with that, she offered a final nod and strode away, clipboard tucked under her arm. I watched her retreat, unsettled. Something in her manner screamed that she was not just a friendly neighbor concerned about noise. She was an enforcer, and I had apparently given her a reason to circle my house like a hawk. The next week passed with few overt incidents, but I remained on edge. From my living room window, I occasionally glimpsed Karen strolling down the sidewalk. She would pause, crane her neck in the direction of my backyard, then jot notes on her ever-present clipboard. It felt invasive, but whenever I ventured outside to see if she needed something, she'd wave politely and continue on. I decided to test the actual decibel level of the oxygen compressor. Borrowing a simple phone app that measured noise, I walked around the perimeter of my yard. The reading hovered around 38 to 42 decibels near the device, dropping to barely 30 at the edge of the property. That was as soft as a whisper or the hush of a quiet library. Rarely did it spike beyond that range. Willow Creek's bylaws, from what I gleaned online, forbade noise above 50 decibels at the property line during daylight hours and 40 at night. My machine should be well within the limit. I typed up an email to the HOA, attaching screenshots of the decibel readings. I explained the medical necessity again, hoping to quell any concerns from neighbors. Unsurprisingly, the official reply came from Karen's email address. She thanked me for providing the data, then insisted we schedule a time for the Architectural and Environmental Committee to confirm. It sounded official, but also ludicrous, an entire committee to check if a quiet oxygen machine complied with noise rules. Still, I agreed, hoping to put the matter to rest once and for all. On the arranged day, Karen arrived with 2 other board members. One was a tall, wiry man named Cliff, who carried a small handheld device presumably for measuring sound levels. The other, Beatrice, was older and looked more sympathetic. They stood by the compressor while Cliff took readings. Beatrice politely asked about my health, while Karen looked vaguely impatient. The results matched mine, 40 decibels at close range, dropping below 35 when you stepped a few yards away. Cliff nodded in satisfaction. "That's well within the permitted limit." Beatrice smiled. "I'm glad to see we can accommodate your needs without disturbing the neighborhood." Karen, however, wore an unreadable expression. She said little aside from, "Thank you for cooperating." Then she left in a hurry. Cliff and Beatrice wished me well and trotted after her, presumably to the next inspection. I felt a wave of relief. With the official test done, my oxygen device was proven compliant. Surely that meant the end of the fuss. For the next few days, the anxious knot in my stomach loosened. I chatted more with Frances, who recounted some of Karen's past interventions, everything from demanding someone repaint their shutters to complaining about the color of holiday lights. "Don't worry," Frances said kindly. "She's bark, mostly. Unless she fixates on you. Then it can get nasty." I hoped there was no more fixation. My machine was found legal and within guidelines, so even Karen had no reason to harass me further. But I didn't yet comprehend how she thrived on controlling the narrative, or how easily a trivial victory, like confirming compliance, could bruise her sense of power. When trouble finally came to a head, I realized that Karen's brand of meddling was not purely rational, nor entirely about the rules. Sometimes, she let her personal annoyance override logic, plunging everyone around her into chaos. Curious about the broader dynamics, I asked around about the history of Willow Creek's HOA. According to Frances and a few other neighbors, Karen wasn't always at the center of everything. She moved in about 8 years ago, promptly joining the social committee to organize holiday events. Folks found her energetic and detail-oriented at first, perfect for tasks like planning a neighborhood barbecue or scheduling a communal yard sale. But her ambition quickly grew. Karen used each small success to gain influence, eventually securing a seat on the Architectural Review Board, which oversaw home exteriors. Later, she lobbied to merge that board with the Environmental Committee, effectively doubling her oversight responsibilities. By the time she orchestrated the successful recall of a previous HOA president for financial improprieties, allegations never fully proven, Karen was recognized as the de facto leader. She picked loyal allies for key roles. Even though she never took the official title of president, everyone in Willow Creek knew she was the real power behind the throne. "She has a knack for spinning small issues into big crises," said Martin, a longtime resident who had once served on a short-lived committee to lighten the HOA's restrictions. Say someone leaves their trash can on the curb an hour too long, Karen might whip out her phone, take pictures, and circulate them with dire warnings about property values and community image. Suddenly, the board is discussing a new fine structure. She's cunning that way. Given this background, my relief about the oxygen machine passing the decibel test started to wane. Karen thrived on micromanaging, especially if she felt personally annoyed. And noise, even if minimal, was one of her biggest triggers. The more I observed, the more I noticed how her desire for control seeped into everything. She would tour the neighborhood daily, wearing a watchful expression. If she spotted a weed in someone's flower bed or a car parked slightly off the driveway, she'd document it with photos. A gentle reminder might be sent first, but if that didn't prompt immediate correction, she'd escalate to formal warnings and threatened fines. Some neighbors just grumbled and complied to keep the peace. Others tried to fight back, but mostly gave up, exhausted by the bureaucracy. I found myself constantly checking if my lawn was trimmed to the exact specification or if my porch light was the approved wattage. It was stifling. And ironically, we lived in a place that outwardly looked so idyllic: tree-lined roads, pastel houses, and shiny mailboxes. None of that indicated the tension simmering below the surface. At the next HOA monthly meeting, I sat in the back to get a sense of how decisions were made. Officially, a man named Keith served as president, but whenever a topic arose, like whether to allow a new variety of fence material, everyone looked to Karen for the final say. She'd smile primly and declare, "Our standards must remain consistent," or, "We have to preserve Willow Creek's harmony," at which point the rest of the board would nod in agreement. The few times another board member tried to propose a more lenient stance, Karen would overshadow them with some cautionary tale about slippery slopes. It was during that meeting that I saw her eyes flick toward me and a fleeting expression of distaste cross her face. In that moment, I realized Karen likely considered me a challenge. My quiet medical device, though technically within the rules, offended her sensibility. She couldn't find me or make me remove it. The formal path was closed. But what about the informal path, those personal actions that bypass rules? I tried to reassure myself that she wouldn't stoop to sabotage. This was America. We had laws protecting medical equipment, right? Yet a sliver of dread took root in my mind. The machine was my lifeline. Without it, I risked dangerously low oxygen levels, especially at night. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that Karen's pride wouldn't push her to do something so brazen. Unfortunately, I underestimated the extent to which her thirst for control and annoyance at losing a battle could warp her judgment. My rational side couldn't imagine that a neighbor, especially an HOA official, would commit an act endangering someone's health. But soon, I would find out otherwise in the harshest way possible. June rolled in with a streak of hot days, the sun glaring over Willow Creek's manicured lawns. My oxygen usage sometimes increased during extreme heat, but I managed with short indoor stints and a fan to help circulate air. Meanwhile, the tension with Karen simmered. I tried to stay out of her way, but small frictions arose regardless. One such incident involved my friend Lucy, who visited me with her golden retriever. She parked in the driveway, letting the dog out for a short bathroom break on the grass. The next day, a notice arrived from the HOA about pet waste concerns, accusing me of allowing an animal to roam without picking up after it. This was absurd. Lucy had meticulously cleaned up. I realized Karen must have been lurking around or possibly checking security cameras, waiting for an infraction. I politely contested the notice via email, pointing out there was no waste left behind. The matter was dropped, but not without Karen sending a terse reply. "We appreciate your prompt attention. Please be mindful of community expectations in the future." That final line read like a threat. "I'm watching you." Another time, I decided to buy a small bench for my front porch, one that matched the house's color scheme and was wholly unremarkable. Almost immediately, I got a text from Frances saying, "Karen's upset you didn't get approval first. She's telling people you might be in violation of the architectural code." I was baffled. A porch bench was hardly a structural alteration. But sure enough, I received yet another friendly reminder from the HOA. So I filled out an official form describing the bench dimensions and color, which they eventually approved. The entire process seemed designed to show me who was boss, rather than maintain genuine standards. The real flashpoint, however, came one blistering afternoon. I heard loud banging behind my house. Stepping outside, I found a group of landscapers trimming bushes near the communal walkway behind my fence line. Karen, standing with them, pointed directly at the small enclosure that housed my oxygen compressor. My vantage point was partially obstructed by the fence, so I couldn't hear the conversation well, but she appeared agitated. I approached cautiously. "Everything okay?" I asked. Karen glanced over, unflustered by my presence. "Just ensuring the landscapers don't interfere with your equipment," she said, her voice dripping with a pretense of concern. "We wouldn't want them to accidentally hit it." I forced a polite smile. "That's kind of you to check. But the unit's secure in the enclosure." She nodded, yet something about her manner felt off. The landscapers looked uneasy, as if they'd been scolded for no reason. One of them muttered an apology, presumably for standing too close to the enclosure. Karen had her arms folded in a posture that spoke volumes of resentment. Later, Frances confided that Karen had been complaining about a constant mechanical drone emanating from my backyard. Frances tried to reassure her it was minimal, pointing out the official decibel readings, but Karen apparently insisted it was still an annoyance, rules or not. A creeping dread took hold. Karen's frustration with the device seemed to intensify, unstoppable by the logic of decibel compliance or the understanding that it was life-sustaining equipment. A conscientious person might have let it go, but Karen's pride was at stake. As neighbors, we all carried on with daily life, mowing lawns and attending block parties, but a subtle undercurrent of fear accompanied me. I dreaded each new official letter or chilly stare from Karen. If she couldn't oust my device through official channels, what else might she do? In the weeks that followed, I found myself triple-checking the oxygen system's reliability. The unit sat on a small concrete pad behind a vented wooden enclosure designed to protect it from rain. Every couple of days, I'd examine hoses, electrical connections, and fans to ensure everything was in working order. My health had stabilized since moving here, but it remained fragile. Any prolonged disruption in oxygen flow could send me into a severe crisis. One day, I discovered that the thin plastic tubing leading from the outdoor compressor into the house had a slight kink in it, almost as if someone had twisted it. No real damage was done, and I dismissed it as a fluke. Perhaps a stray animal brushed against it, or a yard tool bumped it. But the uneasiness lingered, especially recalling Karen's escalations. I told myself not to be paranoid. Willow Creek was a safe place. Nobody deliberately sabotages medical lines, do they? Meanwhile, Karen's presence in the community remained omnipresent. She hovered like a self-appointed monarch, collecting small transgressions, emailing new directives, and ensuring everyone felt her watchful eye. She even started a new anti-clutter campaign, urging neighbors to minimize lawn decorations. Some people complied without argument, but others pushed back. They found the campaign invasive, complaining in hushed tones about Karen's power trip. One neighbor, Ms. Ortega, confided that Karen once threatened her with a fine for putting up a second bird feeder. The official line was that multiple feeders could attract pests, but Ms. Ortega believed Karen just disliked the look. In the end, Ms. Ortega removed it to avoid conflict. "She's unstoppable," Ms. Ortega sighed, shaking her head. "The board listens to every whim she has. It's easier to comply than to fight her." Hearing these stories amplified my worry. If Karen had no qualms about controlling minor aspects of people's yards, would she balk at interfering with my device if she truly found it bothersome? Another concerning sign, I noticed her peering into my backyard at odd times, once even tiptoeing near the fence after dusk. When I called out, she hurried away as if she'd been caught trespassing. Despite the anxiety, I tried to cling to rational thought. We had laws, HOA guidelines, and basic human decency. Hurting someone medically was unthinkable. She might be pushy about noise and aesthetics, but certainly not malicious enough to cause me physical harm. Right? But Karen's frustration was visible. The official decibel check had stymied her ability to ban the device. She had no legitimate avenue left. Some days I almost pitied her, someone so consumed by controlling her environment that she'd target even the medically vulnerable. Yet pity soon turned to dread again whenever I heard footsteps near my fence line or glimpsed her silhouette at dusk. There's a saying about corners. Sometimes, when people feel backed into one, they lash out in unpredictable ways. But in this scenario, it wasn't Karen who was cornered. It was me, and ironically, my compliance with every rule only deepened her resentment. All it took was one step too far, and everything would unravel in a terrifying moment. A scorching afternoon in late July saw me returning from a doctor's appointment. The humidity was thick, the air practically shimmering with heat. My physician had advised caution in such weather, suggesting I rest indoors as much as possible. I complied, hooking myself up to my usual oxygen cannula after lunch and settling in for a quiet read. Midway through the evening, a faint beep alerted me to something amiss with the compressor. The beep was the device's built-in alarm for airflow disruptions. Usually, it would beep if a hose kinked or the power briefly fluctuated. But after a moment, it went silent and the machine's steady hum resumed. I assumed it was a momentary glitch. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke with a jolt, struggling to breathe. My chest felt impossibly tight, like a vice gripping my lungs. My oxygen cannula delivered nothing but the faintest whisper of air. Panicked, I flicked on the bedside lamp. The machine indoors was on, but the flow readout was dangerously low. My pulse oximeter, which I clipped onto my finger, showed a plummeting oxygen saturation. Gasping, I staggered outside to the backyard. The compressor was silent, completely off. Even the red standby light was dead. I noticed at once that the main power switch on the enclosure was flipped down. The thick extension cord that fed from the outside GFCI outlet was disconnected. Also, the valve on the oxygen line had been manually turned. The entire setup had been tampered with. My mind raced. Could the system have overheated? But no, someone had physically turned it off, and the cord was yanked from the outlet. My chest burned with each partial breath. I tried to reconnect it, hands shaking, but realized I needed immediate medical help. My phone was in the living room, so I stumbled back inside to dial 911. Within seconds, an operator calmly told me an ambulance was en route. I sank onto the couch, focusing on short, shallow intakes. The swirling edges of my vision threatened to pull me under. The operator's voice guided me to remain calm, to try to reattach the oxygen line if possible, but I was too weak to manage. All I could do was wait, terror creeping in that every excruciating breath might be my last. Suddenly, from the front window, I saw flashing lights. The paramedics arrived in astonishing speed. 2 of them rushed in, found me pale and gasping, slapped on an emergency oxygen mask from their portable tank. Another paramedic hurried outside to check the compressor. They confirmed what I already knew. It had been forcibly switched off. As they stabilized me, one paramedic muttered angrily, "Who the hell turns off a medical oxygen line?" Another insisted I be taken to the hospital for a thorough check, but after about 10 minutes on their high-flow oxygen, my saturation climbed. I insisted I felt well enough to avoid admission, given the cost and the strain. They complied once I was stable, but not without ensuring my home system was reconnected and working again. Amid the chaos, red and blue lights flashed across the sleepy suburban street. Neighbors peeked from windows, some venturing outside in pajamas. Among them, I spotted Karen standing on her lawn, arms wrapped around herself. Our eyes briefly met. She wore an expression I couldn't fully decode, shock or guilt or something in between. The paramedics finished, advising me to call if any further issues arose, then departed. I locked my door, trembling. The beep of the restarted compressor sounded like a lifeline restored. In a daze, I asked myself, could Karen have done this? The rational side of me balked. Sabotaging a medical device is almost unimaginable. But who else had a motive to silence that humming nuisance? I slid to the floor, tears burning in my eyes, overwhelmed by a mix of relief, anger, and fear. This quiet suburban life I'd sought for my health had turned into a menacing trap, overshadowed by a neighbor who might have tried, intentionally or not, to deprive me of air. The question remained, what now? The day after the incident felt surreal. My exhaustion lingered, a reminder of how close I'd come to a full respiratory collapse. I was determined not to let this pass quietly. So after resting through the morning, I mustered energy to file a police report about the tampering. An officer arrived, took notes, asked if I had evidence. I mentioned the neighbors' repeated complaints, but it was mostly circumstantial. There were no cameras pointing at the oxygen enclosure, an oversight I now regretted. The officer seemed sympathetic but non-committal. We'll keep it on file. If we find any leads or if any witness comes forward, we can pursue it. I realized sabotage without direct evidence was tricky to prove. But at least a formal record existed now. Word spread fast in Willow Creek that an ambulance had rushed to my house in the early hours. Concerned neighbors stopped by. Frances was horrified, bringing me homemade soup. "This is monstrous," she said, her voice trembling. "Even if it was just some random vandal, it's unconscionable." "I'm so sorry." Others offered solidarity, promising to keep an eye on my home if they spotted anything suspicious. By mid-afternoon, I received an email from the HOA. This time, it wasn't Karen's usual stationery. The subject line read, "Urgent Community Notice." Inside, a short message from the official HOA president, Keith, stated, "We are aware of a serious incident involving potential tampering with the residents' medical equipment. While local authorities handle the matter, the HOA strongly condemns any act that endangers a homeowner's health. We remind all residents that harassment or destruction of property is unacceptable. If you have information, please contact us or the police." Keith Palmer, Willow Creek HOA president. Conspicuously, Karen's name did not appear anywhere in that email. This was a departure from the norm, as typically Karen was the mouthpiece for every official communication. Her silence spoke volumes. I wondered if she was lying low to avoid suspicion. Or was she outraged that the HOA had weighed in without her? That evening, a different board member, Beatrice, knocked on my door. She came with soft eyes, offering an apology on behalf of the HOA. "We don't know who did this, but it's awful. The entire board, myself included, will support you in ensuring it doesn't happen again." She gave me her number, promising to expedite approval if I wanted to install security cameras. I thanked her, though the swirling suspicion in my mind kept me from feeling reassured. After she left, I glanced out my window, noticing Karen's house across the street. The blinds were drawn. No sign of life except a single porch light. It was eerie how silent it remained, given her usual presence. Yet, hours later, under the cover of darkness, I spotted a figure stepping onto Karen's porch to speak with her. Through the shadows, I couldn't identify the visitor, but the hushed conversation ended abruptly. The visitor left in haste. It felt like clandestine strategizing. Or perhaps my imagination was running wild. Still, every instinct told me this was far from resolved. While the police investigation offered little immediate progress, the shock of my near-emergency rippled through the neighborhood. People who'd previously dismissed Karen's controlling tendencies now whispered about the possibility that she'd crossed a line. Some refused to believe it. Surely she'd never sabotage a medical device, that's insane. But others recounted her endless complaints and how fixated she'd been on my compressor's noise. Meantime, Keith Palmer, the HOA president, called an emergency board meeting. The official agenda was discussing security and the well-being of residents, but everyone knew the real subtext: Karen's suspected role in my crisis. At Francis's urging, I attended, along with a handful of concerned neighbors. The meeting took place in the small clubhouse near the subdivision's entrance. A hush fell when I entered, my presence a stark reminder of the oxygen fiasco. Karen was there, arms folded tightly, face pale. The other board members wore uneasy expressions. Keith opened the discussion. "First, let me say we're relieved our neighbor is safe after this terrible incident. Tampering with a medical device is beyond anything this community stands for." He cleared his throat. "We need to talk about how to protect residents from such sabotage. We also have to ensure that we, as an HOA, aren't fostering an environment where petty conflicts escalate to life-threatening actions." He invited me to recount the events, discovering the machine off, struggling to breathe, paramedics arriving. My voice wavered as I described the terror. I stopped short of directly accusing Karen. There was no proof, but I mentioned she had repeatedly expressed anger about the device. Karen finally spoke, her tone high and defensive. "I'm sorry you had a medical emergency, but how dare you insinuate I had anything to do with it? I was home sleeping. This could have been anyone, a vandal, a kid playing pranks." I resent the finger-pointing. A neighbor, Ms. Ortega, spoke up, "But you've complained about the device so often. You've hounded this poor person about the noise. Why would a random vandal target a medical oxygen line?" Karen scowled. "All I did was request compliance with noise rules. The device was found to be within the limit. I dropped the issue. Let's not jump to conclusions." Beatrice chimed in, posture stiff. "Karen, you also told me last week that the device still grates on your nerves every time you pass by. You were furious the board couldn't ban it." She paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. "Now an unknown person sabotages it? That's beyond coincidence." Karen's face flashed from anger to panic. She waved her hands dismissively. "I vented in private. That doesn't mean I'd commit a crime. Are we basing guilt on the fact that I found it annoying?" The tension in the room was thick. Keith rubbed his temples. "No one is accusing you without evidence, but the concern is valid. We have to investigate thoroughly." He turned to the rest of the board. "We must consider sanctioning any member suspected of wrongdoing pending an investigation. That includes removing them from certain duties." A stir went through the crowd. Karen's eyes widened. "You can't do that. I've worked for this community for years. This is a witch hunt." A few neighbors voiced that while Karen had done good in the past, this situation demanded clarity. The conversation escalated, with Karen eventually storming out in a huff. The board agreed to let the police handle the criminal aspect, but decided they'd hold a closed session soon to discuss disciplinary measures. After the meeting, Ms. Ortega and others quietly approached me. offering support. They urged me to install cameras immediately. A local friend set me up with a basic system, capturing angles around the oxygen enclosure, front door, and side yard. If anyone tried something again, we'd have footage. I left the clubhouse that night emotionally drained. While the board hadn't officially pinned blame on Karen, the consensus was that something sinister had happened, and she was suspect number one. The glimmer of accountability shone, but the process could still prove messy. Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight. 2 tense weeks passed. The police found no direct physical evidence tying Karen to the sabotage, but rumors ran rampant. Meanwhile, the HOA board's internal disciplinary session approached. A wave of relief washed over me whenever the camera notifications pinged on my phone. I felt safer, though I rarely saw Karen near my property anymore. Possibly she was avoiding me or waiting for the dust to settle. On the day of the special board session, the turnout was huge. Dozens of residents crammed into the clubhouse. The atmosphere crackled with curiosity, tension, and a touch of excitement at the prospect that Karen, so often the untouchable figure, might finally face consequences if the board found her complicit or dangerously negligent. Keith began solemnly, summarizing the events. My medical crisis and ambulance call. The sabotage of the oxygen compressor. Karen's documented grievances about the device's noise. Statements from neighbors about her hostility and obsessive behavior. He clarified that while the police had yet to press charges, the board was addressing potential misconduct under HOA regulations, particularly any violation that endangered a resident's health or well-being. This was grounds for severe penalties, including removal from the board, heavy fines, or more. Karen sat off to the side, arms crossed. When offered the chance to speak, she stood, voice trembling with anger. This is a farce. I've dedicated myself to Willow Creek. I have never sabotaged anything, let alone a medical device. Yes, I disliked the noise. So what? People dislike barking dogs or leaf blowers. That doesn't mean they commit crimes. Beatrice rose next, reading from an email Karen had sent her weeks prior. I can't stand that machine's hum. If I had my way, I'd shut it off for good. The email, while not an admission of sabotage, was damning in the context. Gasps echoed around the room. Karen tried to spin it, claiming it was hyperbole. But the damage was done. The board members looked grim. Keith explained that even if the police lacked conclusive proof, the HOA could act on the pattern of harassment. They had a moral and legal responsibility to protect residents, especially someone with a documented medical condition. Finally, a tall figure in the back, an older man, stood and introduced himself as an attorney living in Willow Creek. I don't represent the HOA, but I can say tampering with medical equipment is a serious offense under state and federal law. If Karen is found to have done this or incited someone else to do it, the liability for the HOA could be huge if they fail to respond adequately. A hush followed. Karen's eyes darted nervously. She launched into a tirade about how the community was railroading her without evidence. But the atmosphere had turned firmly against her. Even some of her old allies looked away, unwilling to defend the indefensible. After hours of debate, Keith announced the board's decision. Karen would be stripped of her position on the HOA board indefinitely, pending any future appeals due to a breach of community trust. She would be fined for harassment and any legal fees the HOA incurred if the police investigation continued. The HOA strongly recommended she refrain from any contact with me and required her to keep away from my property boundaries or face immediate legal escalation. Karen sputtered in shock, tears welling, but her fury overshadowed any sign of remorse. You can't do this. I built this community's standards. You'll regret it. She stormed out to a chorus of quiet condemnation. I sat there, heart pounding. It wasn't exactly a triumphant moment. My trust in Willow Creek had been shaken. Yet relief mingled with vindication. The official body that once empowered Karen now stood with me, at least in terms of punishing her. In the days following Karen's removal from the HOA board, a weight lifted across Willow Creek. Neighbors no longer looked over their shoulders for a clipboard-wielding enforcer. The petty fines and constant demands eased up as the new leadership, led by Keith and Beatrice, took a softer approach. They remained attentive to legitimate issues, but seemed keen to restore a spirit of neighborly goodwill. My health began to improve again, less burdened by the constant anxiety that someone might yank the plug on my life-sustaining equipment. The police file remained open, no direct charges had been pressed, but the evidence of Karen's hostility loomed. She retreated into her home, ignoring most neighbors. Rumor had it she was consulting lawyers, threatening defamation suits, but no such case emerged. Without any sign of forced entry or DNA evidence, the criminal aspect was murky. Yet Karen's reputation was destroyed. The HOA's censure turned her into a pariah. Installing security cameras proved wise. If she or anyone else tried to meddle with my compressor again, I'd have footage. But in the following months, there was no further interference. Most folks believed that Karen, once so bold, had learned a sobering lesson. She'd discovered that one cannot forcibly shape the community to personal whims, especially at the cost of someone's safety. Occasionally, I saw her from a distance, scowling as she walked her dog. She never spoke to me. Francis reported that Karen was rumored to be selling her house and moving away, though the sign never appeared. Perhaps she lacked the courage to start over, or maybe she needed time to accept the downfall of her HOA empire. As for me, I found a measure of peace in Willow Creek. I joined a small group that lobbied for more compassionate rules, ensuring accommodations for residents with special needs. We succeeded in getting the board to formalize a clause preventing any penalties for essential medical devices, clarifying that no resident could override that on the basis of aesthetics or noise. It felt good to transform adversity into positive change. Over time, the memory of that terrifying night dulled, replaced by warmth and normality. I cultivated a small flower garden, took slow walks around the neighborhood, and invited neighbors over for tea. Life wasn't perfect, but it was far better than living in fear. And so, the punishment of Karen was twofold: official removal from power and the scorn of the community she once ruled. Where she had once roamed with a clipboard dictating everyone's choices, she now lurked in the shadows, an outcast. Willow Creek's residents, having witnessed the near tragedy her behavior caused, demanded accountability, and they got it.